Trump's attempts to project strength now reveal weakness, as every defensive move only highlights the cracks in his political and personal image. For years, he crafted a persona of being untouchable, someone who could weather any storm, insult any opponent, and emerge even more powerful. That image once energized his supporters, making him appear larger than life, but today it is unraveling in front of the world's eyes. His strategy of always doubling down, never admitting fault, and always shifting blame is no longer working the way it once did. What once looked like bold confidence now looks like insecurity. The constant insistence that everything is under control clashes with the reality people can see, and instead of appearing in command, he appears cornered. This collapse of image is not happening quietly, it is happening on the biggest stages with the brightest lights, making every stumble magnified. The language he once used to intimidate and dominate opponents is now read as a sign of weakness rather than power. The insults, the nicknames, the exaggerated boasts that used to get laughs and cheers now seem tired, even desperate. His tone is sharper, more defensive, more reactive, as though he knows the walls are closing in and the only option is to lash out. Instead of demonstrating authority, his reactions demonstrate vulnerability, and for a man whose brand has always been built on dominance, that is a fatal flaw. Every time he claims that he alone can fix things or that no one has ever been treated as unfairly, he reminds people of how shaky his grip on control has become. Trump's political rallies once served as a symbol of energy, unity, and unstoppable momentum, but lately, they feel more like desperate attempts to recapture a spark that has faded. The crowds still gather, but the tone is different. There is less excitement, less belief in his invincibility, more focus on grievances and personal vendettas. He repeats the same lines, the same boasts, the same attacks, and instead of sounding strong, it sounds hollow, as though he is trying to convince himself rather than his audience. The collapse of energy in those moments reflects the collapse of his carefully maintained image, a reminder that momentum can evaporate when strength is revealed as weakness. His legal battles only magnify the problem. Instead of rising above them as he once did by framing himself as a victim of political persecution, the sheer number and severity of these challenges now overwhelm his narrative. Each courtroom appearance, each indictment, each headline about investigations chips away at the illusion of control he once held. The man who branded himself as a winner now looks like someone constantly on defense, constantly scrambling to explain away problems rather than dictating the terms of the conversation. The more he insists these cases are meaningless, the more the public sees how much time, energy, and anger he spends on them, highlighting the exact weakness he tries to hide. On social media, his attempts to dominate the conversation also backfire. The all-caps rants, the endless repetition of the same claims, and the constant need to respond to every critic or headline no longer come across as strength. They reveal obsession, fragility, and fear of losing control. Instead of shaping the narrative, he chases it. The platform that once elevated him as an outsider voice of defiance now makes him look like a man struggling to hold on to relevance, his words drowned out by their own volume. His defensive posts, meant to reassure his supporters, often do the opposite. They confirm just how deeply he is rattled. In interviews and press appearances, the strain shows even more. The evasive answers, the contradictions, the moments of confusion are caught instantly and spread everywhere. What once passed as off-the-cuff authenticity now comes across as unpreparedness and decline. Every slip of the tongue, every visibly frustrated reaction, every contradictory statement becomes a headline, reinforcing the perception that the man who once controlled every room he entered can no longer control himself. His image as a fighter is colliding with the reality of fatigue, anger, and desperation. The cracks in his personal image extend beyond politics, too. Once marketed as the ultimate dealmaker, the successful businessman who could transfer his skills into leadership, that narrative has been undercut by failures, bankruptcies, and now legal revelations that erode the myth of financial genius. The brand that promised endless success is being replaced by a portrait of mismanagement and mounting costs. Even in his personal conduct, stories and testimonies that once bounced off him now stick, because the context has changed. A strong figure can brush off scandal, but a collapsing one cannot. His past, once seen as colorful and entertaining, is now being re-examined as evidence of a long pattern of behavior that undermines his image today. What makes his collapse more visible is that Trump himself cannot step out of the spotlight. His entire identity has always been about being the center of attention, but that need for constant visibility ensures that every weakness is seen by the widest possible audience. Unlike other politicians who might retreat, regroup, and re-emerge, he cannot and will not. The cameras are always on him because he demands it, and those same cameras now capture the exhaustion, the cracks in confidence, the unconvincing bravado. His instinct to always perform is colliding with the fact that the performance is no longer convincing. The more Trump fights to protect his image, the more he damages it. Every angry outburst, every exaggerated boast, every desperate attempt to rewrite reality emphasizes the weakness he hopes to hide. The persona of dominance, once his greatest weapon, has become his greatest liability, because it cannot coexist with the visible evidence of collapse. What remains is a man trapped in his own image, unable to admit vulnerability, and unable to hide it either. Instead of silencing critics, his outbursts, denials, and contradictions amplify the sense of collapse and make his situation worse. What Trump has relied on for years is the tactic of going louder, faster, and harsher than anyone else, believing that if he drowned out his opponents, the noise itself would shield him from accountability. For a long time, that strategy seemed to work, because his base admired his refusal to back down and many in the media were caught off guard by his brazen approach. But now, the landscape has shifted. His denials no longer inspire confidence, his attacks no longer land with the same force, and instead of intimidating critics into silence, his reactions give them more ammunition. Each time he lashes out, the public sees not power but fear, not confidence but desperation, and it becomes harder for him to mask the reality of decline. When he faces accusations or reports that cast him in a negative light, the instinct is always to deny them with absolute certainty. Yet the very insistence with which he repeats those denials only keeps the accusations alive. Rather than shutting down a story, his responses make it the center of conversation for days. When he says it's fake news, people take it as confirmation that the story got under his skin. When he calls something a witch hunt, it reminds the public of the many other times he's been investigated, indicted, or called to answer for his actions. His words, meant to erase doubt, end up reinforcing it, and the cycle builds until the denial itself becomes part of the evidence against him. His outbursts, too, reveal more than they conceal. On stage, on television, or online, his anger spills out in ways that show how rattled he really is. The man who once seemed unshakable now seems easily provoked, reacting to every slight, every headline, every late-night joke as if it were a direct threat to his survival. This sensitivity contradicts the image of toughness he has tried to project. Strong leaders don't appear bothered by criticism, they rise above it. But Trump's inability to let even the smallest attack go unanswered makes him appear fragile. His need to always respond reveals how much power his critics actually hold over him, because their words can trigger an eruption that dominates his own message. Contradictions only deepen this spiral. When he says one thing one day and another the next, it creates a sense of chaos that makes him look both untrustworthy and unsteady. In the past, some of his supporters interpreted his contradictions as strategy, a way of keeping opponents guessing. But now, in the context of ongoing investigations, mounting legal challenges, and growing doubts about his leadership, those contradictions look less like clever tactics and more like evidence of confusion or dishonesty. When he insists he never said something that has been recorded on video, it does not silence the critics, it magnifies their point. The contradiction becomes another headline, another meme, another reason for people to question his credibility. Every outburst, denial, and contradiction keeps him in the spotlight, but not in the way he wants. Instead of shaping the story, he fuels it. Journalists no longer need to dig deep to find controversies, they simply wait for his reaction, which inevitably provides them with more content. His words, once capable of setting the national agenda, now trap him in cycles of controversy he cannot escape. The more he tries to defend himself, the more material he provides for his critics, and the result is an endless loop where he is both the author and the victim of his own collapse. The political consequences of this pattern are severe. Allies who once defended him without hesitation now find themselves having to explain his contradictions or downplay his outbursts, which weakens their credibility as well. His constant denials force them to repeat the same talking points, even when those points contradict what he himself said the day before. Over time, this erodes loyalty, as his allies begin to see that defending him costs them more than it helps. Opponents, meanwhile, thrive on the instability, because every new outburst makes their case stronger. Instead of silencing them, he amplifies their voices, giving them more opportunities to attack and more proof that he is unraveling. The legal system, too, reacts differently to outbursts and denials than the political arena. A judge or prosecutor is not swayed by angry rhetoric or dismissive claims of bias, they are bound by facts, evidence, and procedure. Every contradiction in his statements can be used against him in court, every denial can be tested against documents and testimony, every angry attack on legal authorities risks consequences that extend far beyond headlines. By treating the courtroom like another campaign stage, he undermines his own defense, ensuring that his outbursts create more legal risks rather than eliminating them. In the eyes of the public, this constant cycle of outrage and contradiction takes a toll. Voters who once admired his fight now grow weary of the chaos. Swing voters in particular, who may have overlooked the noise in the past because they liked his outsider stance, now see the noise as proof of instability. His insistence on never backing down makes it impossible for him to recalibrate or change course, so the same patterns repeat themselves over and over, wearing down even those who once tolerated them. Instead of appearing resilient, he appears incapable of growth, stuck in a loop of self-destructive behavior. The media, which once struggled to keep up with his non-stop stream of statements, now uses that very stream as evidence of his collapse. Clips of contradictions are played side by side, outbursts are replayed in slow motion, denials are fact-checked in real time. His visibility ensures that every word he says is documented and analyzed, and in that process, the weaknesses in his approach become clearer. Rather than dominating the media cycle, he is consumed by it, trapped by his own inability to remain consistent, calm, or composed. For Trump, the paradox is that the very tools he once used to control the narrative have now turned against him. The denials, outbursts, and contradictions that once made him seem unpredictable and powerful now make him look reckless and weak. They do not silence his critics, they empower them. They do not erase accusations, they validate them. They do not protect his image. They destroy it piece by piece, word by word, reaction by reaction, until the collapse becomes impossible to ignore. The harder Trump tries to control the narrative, the more he loses control, exposing desperation and fueling the perception of a leader in decline. For years, he has thrived on the ability to dominate headlines, to bend media cycles around his every word, and to dictate the topics of conversation both among his supporters and his critics. This approach once worked to his advantage, because he understood the mechanics of attention and spectacle better than most politicians. But now the very instinct that carried him to prominence is accelerating his decline. Each attempt to force the public to see him the way he wants is met with resistance, because the facts, the optics, and the consequences tell a very different story. The result is a widening gap between his narrative and reality, a gap that grows more visible every time he tries to bridge it with spin, denial, or bravado. When he insists he is stronger than ever, that his movement is unstoppable, or that his opponents are weak and divided, the images and reports that follow tell another story. Empty seats at rallies, polls that show erosion of support, and footage of him stumbling in speeches create an unavoidable contrast. His attempts to project confidence only highlight the cracks, because audiences are quick to notice the difference between words and evidence. The more he tries to present himself as invincible, the more people pay attention to the signs of vulnerability, and that creates a cycle where his efforts to control the narrative actually shine a brighter light on his collapse. In politics, controlling the story requires consistency and credibility, but Trump now operates without either. One day he declares total dominance, the next he rails about persecution and unfair treatment. One moment he boasts about winning, the next he complains about being victimized. These contradictions undermine his narrative control, because they create confusion not only for his opponents but also for his own base. Supporters who once admired his clarity and defiance now see a man caught between playing the victim and the victor, and that contradiction weakens his image of strength. Critics, meanwhile, exploit the inconsistency to expose the lack of coherence in his message. The desperation becomes clearest in his tone. Leaders who control the narrative speak with calm authority, but Trump's tone has grown increasingly agitated, erratic, and angry. His interviews are filled with interruptions, defensiveness, and rambling tangents that make it harder to hold on to a coherent story. Instead of guiding conversations, he gets pulled into side battles over minor details, and these diversions make him look reactive instead of strategic. The more he fights for control, the more obvious it becomes that he is not setting the terms of the debate anymore but scrambling to keep up with it. His constant attempts to redefine events in his favor also erode credibility. When he claims a loss is a victory, when he insists a setback is proof of strength, when he labels damaging revelations as irrelevant, the narrative he presents is so far removed from reality that it undermines trust even among those predisposed to support him. People may rally behind him temporarily out of loyalty or defiance, but over time, the dissonance between what he says and what they see becomes unsustainable. Trying to control the narrative by denying reality eventually leads to the perception that he is detached, unreliable, or simply dishonest, which only fuels the sense of decline. The media environment adds another layer of difficulty. In the past, he thrived in a landscape where repetition and spectacle gave him dominance, but now every contradiction and exaggeration is documented, fact-checked, and replayed endlessly. When he claims total control, journalists instantly highlight the evidence to the contrary, and the clips spread faster than his own narrative. By trying so aggressively to steer the conversation, he makes it easier for critics to counter him, because his overstatements provide them with clear openings. His effort to control the narrative becomes self-defeating, giving more visibility to the very stories he wants to suppress. Social media magnifies this problem further. His need to comment on everything, to respond to every perceived slight, creates a trail of posts that expose his shifting narratives in real time. Supporters can scroll back and see the contradictions, critics can juxtapose his statements against evidence, and journalists can use his own words to highlight his lack of consistency. The harder he pushes to dominate platforms with his version of events, the more data points he creates for others to dismantle that version. His desperation to remain the loudest voice ensures that his losses of control are on display for all to see. Legal challenges make this collapse even starker. In courtrooms, narrative control matters far less than documented facts, sworn testimony, and legal precedent. Trump's attempts to brand cases against him as hoaxes or persecutions do not erase the evidence presented in those settings, and when his narrative clashes directly with court rulings or jury findings, the loss of control becomes undeniable. The harder he works to tell supporters that everything is rigged, the more obvious it becomes that he cannot bend institutions to his will in the way he once bent media cycles. This mismatch between rhetoric and outcome exposes desperation, and it weakens the illusion of dominance he tries to maintain. Among allies, the effects are equally damaging. When he tries to dictate talking points, his contradictions and exaggerated claims force them into awkward positions. Some repeat his lines out of loyalty, but others hesitate, aware that embracing his narrative damages their credibility. This splintering among his allies further undermines his control, because it shows he cannot even dictate the message within his own circle. The more he tries to enforce loyalty through pressure and intimidation, the more visible the cracks become, and once again his effort to control backfires, projecting weakness instead of unity. Even his rallies, once the centerpiece of his narrative dominance, illustrate the decline. The carefully staged events used to overflow with energy, creating the impression of a movement growing stronger by the day. But now, repetition of the same lines, complaints about old grievances, and visible signs of fatigue dull the effect. When he tells the crowd he is stronger than ever, the sameness of the performance contradicts the claim. The rally becomes a mirror of his broader collapse, an attempt to recreate past control that instead highlights present decline. Ultimately, the harder Trump fights to control the narrative, the more transparent his desperation becomes. Every boast that denies reality, every contradiction that undermines coherence, every angry outburst that reveals fragility chips away at the perception of strength. His instinct to dominate conversations no longer makes him the master of the story but the captive of it, and each attempt to force control deepens the impression of a leader losing his grip on the very image he has built.